Good afternoon. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's HIS Talk webinar, Making Clinical Communications Work in Your Complex Environment. It's brought to you by Patient Safe Solutions. I'm Lori from HIS Talk and I'll be moderating. We have 3 speakers today. First up will be C. Liu. C is the CEO of Patient Safe Solutions. Joining C will be Steve Shirley, who's the VP of IT and CIO at Parkview Medical Center, and Richard Crutherds, who is the CIO at Peterson Health. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, C.
Thank you so much, Lori, and thank you for everybody who joined us on this call today. We're delighted to be here with you and share some of the learnings from 2 of our esteemed colleagues here from Peterson as well as Parkview Medical Center. To start off, the key learning objectives for today will be concentrated around 4 themes. First of which is to how to develop the right selection team process and solution requirements when you begin to embark upon the journey of clinical mobility selection and clinical communication selection. Second theme is around identifying the key technology considerations and pitfalls to avoid along the way. The third being how to establish a rollout and governance recommendations that are critical for the ongoing success of this project. Last but not least, how to evaluate the value of a platform that can actually unify clinical communication needs and workflow needs onto a single platform. But before we start, let's learn a little bit about both institutions here. I'll turn it over to Steve to start talking about Parkview's background a little bit. Steve?
Thanks, C. Parkview is located in Pueblo, Colorado. For our audience, that's about 100 miles south of Denver. We were established in 1923 and serve in the area of about 160,000 folks here in our community. But more importantly, we are also a catchment area hospital with about 370,000 lives, serving all of southeast Colorado and southern Colorado as a hospital of higher care for those areas. We are 350 beds in terms of license, and we are a certified level 2 trauma center. So we're really, in this part of the state, we're the only level 2 trauma center. And finally, we are certified in stroke as well as orthopedics. We are just certifying in cardiac. We are also in women's emergency and neurological services. So very excited to do what we do, caring for our community each day.
Thank you, Steve. Richard, let the audience know a little bit about Peterson Health's background as well. Thank you.
Okay. We're a small 125-bed nonprofit community hospital located in the hill country of Texas. That's about 60 miles north of San Antonio and 100 miles west of Austin. Although we've been serving the community since 1949, the first 50 years was in the same building downtown, but we were fortunate enough to be able to move into a brand new facility in 2008, which is a beautiful 35-acre campus that provides a peaceful, healing environment in which to take care of our patients. We're also proud to be the only Texas hospital that was awarded a top 20 rural community hospital designation. We pride ourselves in IT as being more than just a support department. We aggressively include our IT staff in our hospital-wide focus of providing exceptional, compassionate, patient-centered care in our facility.
Thank you both. So Richard and Steve, we've been working together for a while now, and one of the key things that strikes me about both of your institutions is that when you first got into mobile clinical communications, you each had a very clearly defined list of problems to solve. Would you give the audience a little bit background on the initial issues you were looking to address? Richard, how about we start with your side first?
Okay, our major driver was the proliferation of non-approved, unsecured texting between our physicians and also between our staff and physicians. The longer we took to implement something, the more workarounds we saw creeping into our environment. Secondly, we needed to improve collaboration between our care team members, especially between our ED providers and our hospitalist providers. And then from a technology standpoint, we had SpectraLink phones that were a dying breed, and we needed a more robust solution to replace them.
Thank you. Steve, how about at Parkview?
Well, very much looks a lot like what Richard's experienced. One of the things that we visioned a number of years ago is the creation of a collaborative care team. And so we really had this vision that we wanted physicians, and especially hospitalists like most of our audience has, nurses, pharmacists, phlebotomists, respiratory therapists. We really wanted everyone in a group that was assigned to a specific patient to be able to understand who else was in the group and really be able to center the care of the patient around that platform or that opportunity. Like Richard, we have a boatload of SpectraLink phones that we needed to replace, and so this was a great opportunity for that. Needless to say, text and voice are a big issue, and you know, I think I'll talk more about this later on, Steve, but it really is a situation where we try to minimize the number of platforms and not get into multiplicity of systems. And so we really wanted a system that gave us all of that collaborative care tool in addition to text and voice. We wanted mobile access to our EMR. So, you know, we know as a Studer hospital that the more time our nurses and doctors get to spend with a patient, the better that patient does, and the better we all do in terms of their care. So we absolutely wanted something that would give us some clinical and other data for that patient through the system. And then I think finally, see, one of the bigger points, like everybody else, is that we're very much focused on making sure that we treat the patient right, that we have good HCAP scores. And, you know, for us, physician communication, as an example, is very, very important. We've not had the best scores over the years, but certainly as we started to move into this project, we knew we'd have an opportunity to do something that would be special and would help improve those physician scores.
Yeah, so I think the commonality between both of your initial list of problems to solve, we're seeing more and more in the marketplace at large. As soon as we've seen you identify these list of problems and we're able to decompose them, so to speak, we've noticed an interesting trend of what starts as a device replacement requirement for some of the aging phones has gotten and translated into a set of goals and requirements that's on a much broader platform basis. You were both very successful in your respective institutions in terms of the process with which you aligned the needs against the goals and defining what success would look like. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about the mobile communication goals at Parkview?
Well, I think, see, one of the most critical goals we had was, as I've kind of talked about with this collaborative care team, they're really the ability to connect, you know, all of our clinicians. And I'll give you a quick example. We have our phlebotomists using this solution for phlebotomy collection and specimen labeling, and it's become so powerful to have the phlebotomist and the nurse in communication through this system and this device in terms of when collections are taking place and what the process is. And so I'm very excited about where that's gone. You know, as I mentioned previously, it's very important for us to try to get our nurses in the patient room as much as we can. Every time they have to run back to the nurse's station, that's time they can't spend with the patient, improving the quality of their care. So that was very important. You know, obviously, patient safety is a big deal for every person in this audience, and we focus on that each and every day. One of the things that's impressed me is when you look at all the complex workflows we have in healthcare, it's very important to try to orchestrate and to bring all that together into an opportunity, a solution, a system that lets you manage it and lets you do it in an effective and efficient way. One of the things that we haven't done, and we'll probably learn this from Richard's hospital as they move forward, is some of the things we do around nurse call and reducing interruptions. It's really important for our patients not to have to listen to conversations that are happening that may not be relevant to them or germane to their care. And so that was one of the goals we have as we work through this system. And, you know, finally, you know, we have on the slide there reducing inefficient communication loops. And I would say there that when we get to a slide later on that talks about our successes, we're going to see that the ability to have a system and the goal to have a system that minimized the amount of time we have to move back and forth either to a nurse's station or the lab or pharmacy or whatever it might be was absolutely an important and a critical goal for us, because that's how you spend more time with the patient.
Thank you, Steve. And you've certainly done a marvelous job in communicating a set of simple and easy to understand goals for all of your staff as well as your executive stakeholders. And goals are obviously one side of the ledger, and it wouldn't be complete without a clear set of requirements that somebody in a CIO's capacity would hold the vendor side as well as their staff side accountable to really measure up against as well as track against the delivery. Richard, what are some of the key requirements at Peterson once you've embarked on this project as well?
The obvious issue that all of us face is that communication needs to be secure, but we also focused on the user interface. We have some contract users that don't work every week. We want to make sure that the user interface was intuitive, it was easy to use, and it required very little training. I'd say probably the largest part of our selection criteria was the EMR integration. The ability to have bidirectional data flow to and from the system was just one of our basic requirements. If the systems couldn't do that, we just weren't interested in looking at them. And part of that integration was the replacement of manual processes between our staff assignment acuity systems and our physician assignment within our nurse call staffing systems.
That's very helpful. And Steve, do you have any additional requirements at Parkview? I know there's some commonalities shared there, and if you have some additional ones, it'd be good for the audience to understand as well.
Well, I think, I wanted to emphasize a couple things. In terms of voice and text, just a very quick story. We have a hospitalist group that we've moved internally as employees, but previously they were contracted, and the communication system they had was unidirectional, and so our nurses had the ability to communicate out to a physician, but had no way for them to communicate back. And so really it was a requirement that we had a system that was bidirectional. I think the other piece, as I mentioned earlier, is that we really wanted a system that did all of this in addition to voice and text, all the other pieces, so that we didn't have multiple systems to try to work with. Because if we do that, we almost kind of have SpectraLink plus another system plus a voice and text. So we really went that direction. One of the things that we do in our selection process, which we're going to talk about here in a few minutes, is we really look very hard at the companies that we work with in terms of their viability. We look at their strength financially. We look at their internal controls and how well they actually are running their business. And for us, we really needed to make sure that we had an enterprise-grade solution. And enterprise-grade is not only the vendor that we partner with, but also the device, and we'll talk more about that. And so I think for us, that was a pretty serious requirement, because there's a lot of incredible development being done right now today by companies out there that want to get into this space. But we aren't really a bleeding edge for the most part company, and didn't want to take a lot of risk there. We also wanted to support future growth. I wanted an open architecture platform that allowed me to do other things, as well as a company that we could develop something new every other month and bring more power and more efficiency to our staff. And so that was an important consideration to us too. And a quick example, we now have the ability to queue up educational videos for our patients on their TVs in their rooms through our patient-safe devices. So that was a great opportunity for our nurses to be able to do this without having to go to yet a different control platform. And that kind of leads me, right into our next slide, which really talks a little bit about why we chose Patient Touch. And again, I think it's so important to think about the fact that we didn't want to have a multitude of systems. And so, we looked at Patient Safe because obviously we got the text and the voice capabilities, but we also had the ability to put this whole care team together. That has proven to be phenomenal in terms of our success. We wanted to have the patient in clinical context. And so it's not just a communications device, it's an absolute care device. We call them point of care. And so we knew that had to be part of the selection. We also really view ourselves going into results notifications, alert stuff. We think it's important that a nurse, if they're going to stay close to the patient, has to be able to see any kind of critical alerts on labs or things of that nature, as well as any other alerts that need to come through the system available right there. And so I think, as we looked at all these pieces, I think that's one of the reasons that when we looked through 5 different companies to come up with this solution, Patient Safe rose to the top.
Thank you, Steve. And your journey in sort of painting out the broad strokes of what does a platform look like, I believe audience on the call would probably resonate with, in terms of the gradual consolidation of the disparate needs of mobile at the point of care. And it can't just be a single purpose device or it can't just be a single purpose application there. And there exists an opportunity for a platform with which you can layer on top of both your clinical EMR as well as telephony and networking infrastructure to allow you to innovate, to allow you to impact the digital transformation objectives while managing all the cost component and physician and staff satisfaction component. However, this endeavor is not made, as you both know, overnight. The journey can be complex and the journey can sometimes be painful. So let us move on to the section of your journey towards the adoption for this and some of the key lessons learned along each critical juncture, starting with the selection process. And then we'll go into a little bit about planning. I think you have some very interesting lessons to share there. And certainly the very deliberate and intentional approach you've taken to implementation. And lastly, we'll end at probably the governance piece and to share with the audience on what are the different approaches that you've taken there. To start off with the solution selection section, Richard, can you start off with some of your learnings in terms of what you put in place during this phase?
Yes, I'd like to speak broadly about how we do our technology selection, which is the same process that we applied in this particular case. But in general, all of our technology system purchases are balanced against our IT strategic plan, a major part of which is interoperability. We find that this quickly weeds out many vendors from the discussion. So if you have a physician or director who wants to implement something they liked from a system that they came from, we run it against our plan. If it doesn't fit into our strategic initiatives, we just don't do it. So even if it's neat technology, we can often filter out systems that don't match up. We have an IT steering committee that's comprised of a core group of our C-suite, and they make the final decision on these products. So this takes the politics out of it. IT's not making the decision, the steering committee's making the decision. And we found out for a long time, and we fought with the issue that messaging solutions were labeled IT projects, and by involving the staff, physicians, administration in the selection process, we get their buy-in that makes sure everybody's pulling the same direction, and then that ensures the project's a success.
Thank you, Richard. And Steve, I'm sure you can resonate with the last point here in particular. What about at Parkview? What are some of the nuances on your side when you're dealing with a solution selection process?
Well, see, much like Richard, we also use a technology steering committee. We have a very formal solution selection process. We go through a request for proposal that is very, very deep in terms of not only feature functionality, but as I was mentioned earlier, we also ask prospective vendors to talk to us about everything from their contracting practices to the type of internal controls they have, their securitization of their systems. We talk to them a little bit about how they install, how they train, how they support. And so it's a pretty firm process with the RFP. Then we do a weight-based matrix for evaluation, followed by demonstrations and of the products and then site visits. I think the key things is that we require all new software system acquisitions to come through our tech steering committee. Multidisciplinary group, we've got everybody from medical records to lab to pharmacy, radiology, nursing representation in a few other areas, and so as well as IT, of course. And so that's very, very powerful as we start to look at these projects. One of the things that helps us do is avoid rogue purchases. When I first got here, I found that it was not uncommon to have somebody purchase a software system and then call IT and say, please install this. And, as we all know, I think everybody in the audience has maybe experienced this, you get into a situation where you can't really validate that it's going to integrate well into your EMR or that the systems you've got in place from a hardware perspective are suited well for it. And so you end up with unintended costs and a lot of unintended problems. Another piece that, and probably the most important for us, is the involvement of the clinicians in the process. We very much here, if it's a process, a system that will involve clinicians, we require their participation. And so in our project management process, we have a charter. And in that process, the physicians are given a risk management matrix that identifies the fact that if they don't participate, they will really deter from the success abilities of the project. And I wanted to share, just real quick, we last year put in a new anesthesiology project, and we shared this risk with the two lead physicians in the anesthesiologist group. And what we achieved was a level of cooperation, of involvement that I don't think I've ever seen before. They were with us all the way through the process, every day for process planning, for strategic planning. They went on site visits. That project is probably one of the best 3 installs we've ever seen here at the hospital. So I can't emphasize enough how powerful it was to have them there. So really, our standardized process for selection has made this thing a lot easier for us to work through.
Thank you, Steve. And I think the key takeaway here is that you were both very consistent in creating an overarching strategic technology charter that your mobile communication process will adhere to. And you ended up providing a very clear set of selection criteria as well, that owners within your respective departmental leaders, physician leaders, executive leaders, were able to persist throughout the go-live period, as well as the post-go-live adoption process, to keep both the vendor and the hospital side informed and accountable for the results. One of the key things along the selection process that I think we spend a fair amount of effort on both sides, coming into a common understanding and creating the best effort towards, is really around device selection and management. So we'll start with Richard's side to see if there's any comments or insights Richard can give the audience around what they did in this section.
Well, if everyone used the devices that we provided, then our lives would be much easier. We all know that's not feasible, but BYOD is going to happen, so you might as well prepare for it. Steve's going to get into the weeds on that a little bit more detail, but even though the majority of our devices are provided by us, there are always the other users needing to use their own devices, which brings a whole different level of complication into the support environment. For a small hospital, mobile device management is a critical element. We have limited IT staff for support, so it was really important to us to have a good tool to manage and monitor those mobile devices.
Thank you, Richard. Steve, would you expand on that as well? I think you share some common experiences across the board.
Well, boy, Richard, first of all, I'm just going to echo about everything you said in terms of some of these things that we probably should have learned from you in the first place. But, you know, for our owned, or the devices that we put together for and selected for the patient safe installation, we chose iOS because, you know, first of all, we knew it would expand across platforms very nicely. And so whether we wanted to use an iPhone or an iPad or any device like that, we also knew that that operating system was fairly consistent across those devices. Interestingly enough, and boy, I concur, Richard, on the BYOD piece, when we started to deal with our physicians in BYOD, we began to experience the challenges that you get with, for instance, the droids, in terms of, I think there are 5 current operating systems. And so depending on the physician's device and how old it is and what particular manufacturer it is, we began to have to deal with 5 different versions of droid operating systems. So, you know, really, when we looked at device selection, I think we made the right decision as far as the devices we bought to focus on the iOS and what the iPhone did for us. Needless to say, security is a huge consideration. Richard, I had to chuckle when you were talking about mobile device management, because from a provisioning perspective, we did make a great leap there in understanding immediately, and found ourselves handling 400 different devices each time we had to do an upgrade. And so it wasn't long before we quickly learned that we needed a mobile device management solution to help us provision those devices. You know, certainly one of the requirements was battery life on these devices. And so, you know, we did a lot of work on making sure that a nurse could get all the way through a shift, or potentially have a little bit of a charge somewhere in the shift to get through that. Pretty important piece. The other piece is, on your slides, you'll notice it says soft scan. So when Parkview started with this solution, we were using a jacket that had a scanner in it and an extra battery. And I have to say, the device worked absolutely fabulously. The only real downside was just size when you put the jacket on the device. The good news was no one could tell it was an iPhone, and so we really only had 2 devices disappear over the first few years. But we really knew we needed to move towards something a little more sleek and a little more functional. So soft scan is really the ability to use the native camera on the phone, and we are absolutely moving in that direction. And so I'd absolutely advise, as our peers out there in the audience start to look at device, things with soft scan become pretty important because it absolutely gets you a much sleeker device. It's easier for the nurse to use, and I think that's going to be successful for us.
Thank you, Steve. And a point of clarification for the audience that might not be familiar with soft scan, it's the fundamental ability to use the native camera on any smartphone to serve as an industrial grade barcode scanner that can support other applications that we're going to be talking about later on as well. So device is certainly a key piece of the consideration here. And as we move down the stack, as we call it, getting into the infrastructure side, this is one key area where we've had a lot of fun going through the learning curve and developing a deep appreciation for what it takes for mobile communication projects to be successful. Steve, would you share some learnings from Parkview's approach when it comes to infrastructure, especially the networking side?
Yes, Ian, and I would need to begin with an interesting conversation I had a week ago. One of our anesthesiologists and I were huddled having some conversation, and the topic got off on the incredible number of devices that are stressing our home wireless networks, camera systems and security systems and computers and devices that turn your lights on and all those things. And we were talking about, how far can we go, at our homes with our existing infrastructure to be able to handle all these neat gadgets. And that quickly translated into something I call wireless wellness, which is really the state and the wellness of our wireless network at the hospital. When we first started with Patient Safe, we had we've got a very good wireless network, and things went incredibly well. But as we moved into the communications part, it became clearly obvious that we wanted to make sure that we had not only good, solid phone communications. We didn't want to have calls breaking up or lost, but we wanted to make sure we could roam well. So we did something that I'm so proud of and so excited about. We actually brought Patient Safe Solutions and their wireless vendor in. We brought in our networking vendor. Apple came in and spent time with us, and then we had our own Parkview engineers and our external wireless consultant all come together, and we spent a week tweaking our wireless infrastructure. And it was amazing the little tweaks we made, not only with things like the power of all the access points, but just basically heat maps of whether we had the right number of access points, whether we weren't oversaturated, things of that nature. So that turned out to be an incredibly productive process, because as we moved into the communications piece, we've had little to no problems at all. The other thing, though, C, that I worry about is, as we talk about adding more and more devices to our infrastructure, having different manufacturer systems start to have configuration issues that compete with each other. And so, I give you an example. We put in, just not too long ago, a new wound care system. And so with that was wireless laser cameras that allowed the nurses to do their documentation on wounds. And the advice and the actual rule that I gave to my staff as we embarked on that project was to make sure that as we configured our wireless network to handle those cameras, that we didn't stomp on the configuration that we had for our Patient Safe iPhones. And so, that turns out to be something that I worry about every time we put in a new wireless system, in terms of making sure we don't have competing configuration issues. So very important issue for us.
Thank you, Steve. Richard, what do you see as the priorities during your infrastructure planning stages?
Well, I'm afraid we're going to be the poster child for how not to do it regarding wireless. I guess we'll just have to be consoled by the fact that some of you might be able to learn from our mistakes. But we made several assumptions. Since we were happy with our previous wireless environment, we supported a ton of devices. It was very stable. We were really proud of it. But bringing the smartphones into the environment was really a different ball game. We felt like initially we could come up with a patient-safe product in our current environment, even though we had a major upgrade schedule. But the fact of the matter is, we actually had to stop the project for a time to do the upgrade before we could reliably support the new devices. And like Steve said, it has to do with roaming issues and signal strength. And it's just as bad to have too many APs as it is to have too little APs. So on another note, we had other considerations in our wireless network beyond just the voice and messaging. We have an RTLS system for our infant abduction system, and we had plans to expand it to include other tracking. And so we just needed to make sure as we built our wireless infrastructure that those configurations that we were moving to in the future didn't conflict with each other by fixing one problem and causing another.
Thank you. And I think the key takeaway here really is how to test and manage the entire wireless network during the infrastructure planning stage as a holistic interdependent system with lots of endpoints and perhaps other application that's relying upon it, and not in silos of hardware, software, and firmware. That's a truly important perspective that we've been able to take on to all of our ongoing conversations with folks who are in the selection process. And another key factor to consider is really vendors' ability to help you support and manage your device fleet, which is a service that we would include in the pre-contracting period here as well. So if we move on to implementation here, this is a process that can be fraught with challenges still. Steve, what were some of the key points that you've identified in order for a successful implementation to occur?
Well, I'll start by telling you that on January 2nd, I celebrate 40 years in IT. And, one of my favorite cliches over all of my career has been that broken processes don't get fixed by new computer systems. And so, on the slide, we put assess workflow first, then optimize. And I could tell you that we absolutely force ourselves each time to do value stream mapping. We look at process flows. We call it brown paper mapping. And so we literally bring all of the key stakeholders into a great big conference room and sit down with a giant roll of brown paper and start to map out all the processes. I think every implementation we do where we make that the highest focus is much more successful than putting in a new system and having your end users say, well, it didn't accomplish what we needed to do. I think my other point, C, that is something we've had to focus on, and Richard, you talked about lessons that you had to learn that might be, for everybody in the audience, something not to do. Training and education is something that makes or breaks the implementation of systems. We are big believers in the laws of diffusion of innovation. We understand that no two people learn the same way. And so we understand that if we try to train a staff of 800 nurses all the same way, we're going to have some challenges as to how successful we are in a project. So we've really started to focus on, in the implementation, how do we do training in many different ways? How do we look at our rolling thunder rollouts and how effective that'll be? We call it elbow to elbow support when a system goes live, and really providing a variety of ways to learn. I gave you a quick example with our physicians. We ended up working on our last install with a situation where we not only held classroom training, but we would go to a few physicians' offices. In one case, we even went to the physician's house because that was most appropriate for him. And I can't tell you how well that guy's done with the system. And so the training piece becomes just pretty critical.
Thank you, Steve. Richard, what are your thoughts here?
I would echo Steve's assertion that the just automatically duplicating your current workflows is really a mistake. We found that Patient Safe was really proactive in encouraging and leading our teams to re-examine and validate our workflows. One that comes to my mind was a convoluted process we had of notifying our hospitalists of their need to do an admission from the ER. And we had a process where the EMR sent a message to a virtual printer, and that was captured and parsed and sent to a text through an email, and then that notified a specific pager, and that pager had to be handed off from shift to shift, and on and on and on. So we were able to just simplify that process greatly by just rethinking our goals and using the new technology that we had in place. From a training standpoint, the major takeaway for us was just not to train too early. It's when you're working out your schedules, you have a lot of people to train, so you're tempted to allow people to train early. And we found that even 2 weeks in advance with no exposure in between is just not a productive, timely way to train folks.
Thank you both. And I think the key here throughout the implementation journey, we cannot emphasize enough, is all about workflow at the end of the day. When you have proper workflow assessment and proper workflow alignment, as you can tell from both Richard and Steve's stories here, that this alignment will positively impact rollout, positively impact training, adoption, and care team satisfaction, and also maintaining the ability to be able to revisit these workflow in almost near real time. And that's a capability I'm sure is a welcoming sign for the CIOs who have been through these intensive EMR implementation, that a mobility platform can provide more flexibility for more workflow optimization there. Speaking about post-implementation period, as we get into the ongoing support and governance pieces of the consideration here, one of the most remarkable things both of you have done is to enable a governance structure on an ongoing basis to ensure the adoption of the solution. And you're on a path towards desired results as well. Your emphasis in the selection process on being clear in terms of what exactly you're buying and what exactly you're deploying served you well during the governance period as well for that consistency. Richard, would you talk a little bit about Peterson's approach to governance here?
We pretty simply just leverage the same technology steering committee that was in the selection process to participate in the ongoing governance. Although we bring in ad hoc members as needed, depending on what the system is, that steering committee will stay involved all the way from the pre-selection process through deployment and ongoing through the governance stage.
Steve, at Parkview, do you share some of the similar initiatives, and what additional aspects did you put into your support and governance side?
Well, see, we've actually gone kind of a different direction there. We have a forum, a group here at the hospital called the NFL, Nursing for Leadership. And so really it's a group of not only our CNO, but all of our nursing directors, right down to some of our nurse managers. And they meet every week to really govern and to drive a consistent and an enterprise-wide approach to how we work with nursing. And so they really create the governing body for all of our clinical comms and communications and the things we do. But attached to that, and something I get excited about, is the fact that, really because of the incredible analytics capabilities that our system has with Patient Safe, we've enabled our clinical informatics team to create a plethora of different analytics for nursing leadership to look at. And so we can look at all of the different numbers of phone calls. We can look at transcripts of texts. It's really an awesome opportunity to follow up with nurses that perhaps need a little retraining or perhaps just really need to take a different direction. And we let those clinical informatics folks create all that analytics. Additionally, the clinical informatics team really drive the day-to-day support of the system. And so part of the governance aspect that they take on is such things as keeping the wellness of all of our devices in check and making sure that the fleet is out there, that it's appropriate, that it's functioning, and some of those kind of things. So we get excited about those two things kind of working together as far as our governance.
Absolutely, and it's been such a remarkable journey with your clinical informatics team to see how they weave together the requirements from different teams and gradually shepherd that into an enterprise-wide initiative. The key takeaway here, listening to both of you and also learning how you've approached it in order for the project to have ongoing success, is to really treat the mobile clinical communication initiative with an enterprise-wide engagement model and try to avoid, as you referred to earlier, of it being considered as an IT-only initiative. We know that it encompasses network. We know that it encompasses telephony. We know that clinical informatics increasingly important role, and we know the visibility across clinical and operational leadership is all important. And the more you can generate data along the way, the better it is. That allows everybody to participate together. And since we're on different points of the journey of adoption here, comparing to the two of your organization, why don't we turn over to Steve to talk about the outcomes Parkview has already accomplished and some of the additional things that you are looking to accomplish further here as well.
Well, thanks, Ian. This is an area that this is probably the most exciting slide for me of the entire presentation today, because we just feel so great about and so positive about what our nurses have accomplished and what our IT team has accomplished in working with and collaborating with our nurses. Probably one of the most incredible statistics is what you see on your slide with 100% bedside specimen collection and cross-labeling and cross-matching. So we nowadays do not leave the bedside without every specimen labeled. The number, you can imagine how well that has helped us to eliminate errors. The other nice thing it does is it helps keep our phlebotomists very efficient and effective in what they do. Kind of tied to that is the fact that now with voice and text, the phlebotomist can move very fluidly and very quickly throughout the hospital without a lot of return trips to the lab or a lot of phone calls to try to figure out where they need to go next. So that's a big number for us. I think, like most of our peers on this conversation today, I think we all probably have really good med administration error numbers, but for us, the use of this point of care system and what we've accomplished is really created a 60% decrease in med admin errors. And I think all of us understand how critical that can be in terms of patient safety and what we accomplished there. We went through our analytics process and determined that by keeping the nurse from having to run back and forth to the nurse's station, and by enabling them to do some of the things they do with their iPhone, we've saved about 60 minutes per nurse per shift. And that's very important because, again, we're trying to find every minute we can to get the nurse back in the room with the patient. And so that's been an important outcome for us. And then I think finally, I talked early in the presentation about HCAHPS, and medication education is obviously so important. It's a meaningful use requirement. We've seen a 210% increase in our scores. One of the things we love about the Patient Safe system is it's got something called first dose education. So, when a nurse is in the room with a patient and they're doing a med pass and they happen to come across a medication that the patient has not taken before, and I'll qualify that by saying that through the med reconciliation process at admission and through the various meds that have been prescribed during the stay, it's determined that this is a new med. The Patient Safe system will actually queue up first dose education. And so the nurse right then has an opportunity to tell them about what this med does and what the side effects might be and why they're taking it. And we've had just some really wonderful patient feedback about what we've accomplished in that area. And so we're excited about those outcomes, and it just gets better every day. So we kind of look at this analytics once every few months, and I think we'll continue to see some of these numbers improve.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, we're very excited about the ability to weave the notification texting capability together in a closed loop for that kind of a prompting and alerting that's really embedded into your workflow. Richard, while you still are a little bit on the earlier end of the journey, what have you identified as some of the key outcomes at Peterson that you intend to go after?
Well, we indeed are very early in the maturity of our system compared to Parkview, but we anticipate measurable progress in some of the same areas that they've been measuring. But one area of focus for us is physician satisfaction. They've been frustrated in the past with being able to communicate effectively with our staff, and that's one of the areas that we're confident that we'll see measurable improvement.
Thank you both very much. As we conclude a discussion session here and move on to the question section a little bit, I'd like to just re-summarize for the audience some of the top key takeaways across the board. The first one is really how to use one consistent charter to review and compare the selection criteria and go live results to keep both sides accountable. You've heard also how to test and manage the infrastructure as a holistic, interdependent set of systems rather than in silos of hardware, software, and firmware. You've also heard from both CIOs here how not to treat clinical communication deployment as just a phone replacement or just an IT project, but rather to approach it with a governance model that can ensure enterprise-wide engagement. At the end of the day, if we can have one key takeaway for you to leave from this, it's all about the workflow, regardless of which end of the spectrum you enter into the selection process first. Getting the workflow right first can have long-term benefits throughout the adoption journey. Thank you both very much for covering all of those. I'd like to turn over to the audience a little bit for questions. Some of them have been coming in, and I'll go ahead and prompt some of the questions to Richard and Steve here on one of the first questions I believe that came in. The question is, who and what type of roles are members of your technology steering committee? Richard, do you want to take that since you did mention that was in place in the very beginning?
Okay, we have a fairly small group to start out with, and then we call in ad hoc members depending on the system we're looking at. But the core team is our chief nursing officer, deals with the nursing primary clinical parts. Our COO is administrative representative. We have an assistant administrator that's over all of the ancillary departments, and then our CFO obviously over the financial piece. And we have a CMO who is a retired physician who represents the physician viewpoint and their view of what we're looking at.
Thank you, Richard. The next question on the audience list is, what patient and clinical data does the care team have access to via the communication solution? Steve, I think you mentioned that in your comparison slide earlier here as well. Would you like to take that one?
Oh, you bet, see. In MView, which is what we call that piece of the system, we get the opportunity to look at not only the patient's ADT info, but we also see, general things like medical record number. We see some of their stuff on general allergies and those things. Then we also get information on their meds, their vitals, and their labs. And so we really give a nice little snapshot picture of both sides of ADT and of some of the base medical information to the providers.
Thank you, Steve. And we're definitely seeing more and more questions streaming in. In the event that we don't get to all of them, we'll be sure to follow up by sending some of the feedback and responses after the session as well. The next question along the queue here is, do you have any recommendations for the right departmental approach or the first group to start the implementation with for something like this? Who should be first and why did you decide it that way? Richard, do you want to start by talking about on your side?
Okay, our approach was to try to pick and kind of tippy-toe into it and pick units that did not have a lot of interoperability between the physicians. So that may not be the right terminology, but what I mean is women's health had a fairly limited number of physicians that they dealt with who did not work with other units. So we brought women's health first, followed by the acute rehab unit, because they had a finite number. We felt if we went to, like, for instance, the surgical unit with a lot of different hospitalists, community physicians, consultants, it would be a little more complex, and we wanted to kind of phase it in more slowly. And while we were doing those clinical units, we went ahead and brought in pharmacy, environmental services, our house supervisor, and some of the smaller departments that we felt like would be good candidates. And to be honest, we picked departments that we felt like we could get good feedback from as we were solving issues. We wanted the departments that had directors that were on the team, supportive, and could help us.
Thank you, Richard. And Steve, I think I'll lead over to you with sort of a combination of a question, because I think this is relevant in your journey of adoption and some of the answers that you've given about the patient and clinical data integration. This question from the audience is around, what is the bidirectional integration that was accomplished? I think this is referring to some of the data that you might have talked about earlier on. And what is the EMR used in your setting?
Well, so see, I think, a couple things, and I want to just quickly add on to what Richard was talking about. We did kind of a rolling thunder for all the patient safe system, but when we rolled out comms to our physicians, we did our hospitalists first, followed by our residents, because it's a teaching hospital, we're a teaching hospital, and then we're moving through all of our employed physicians, and then we'll finally roll it out to all community physicians. But, when I look at the integration and the EMR capabilities, we have unit-based hospitalists, and so on each floor, we have the ability now for a nurse to text a hospitalist and say, here's what's going on. The hospitalist can take their device, quickly look at what the patient's information is as far as what meds they've got, when they were administered, what their vitals are, any lab results that have come back, and then they can appropriately guide that nurse into the next process. What we experienced before that was, with the other system that they had, was the nurse would send that communication out. The physician would see it almost like a page and would have to call them. But the ability for that busy physician to call that nurse back was just incredibly difficult. And so, it's been pretty exciting to watch how quickly they are able to get this communication back and forth with this system.
Absolutely. And Steve, could you give the audience a sense of what EMR that you're using and the type of integration that we were able to enable to get those data back and forth?
Well, we are a Meditech platform, and one of the things that, and I think everybody in the audience probably has had this challenge, whether you're, Meditech, Cerner, Epic, and go on down the list, but we really had to work diligently, and I'm almost going to say the word forcefully, but we were able to accomplish some really exciting things with Meditech in terms of integration, where we've got the med administration record going back into the EMR, which means the physician, those physicians that aren't on their mobile device can absolutely look at the EMR to find out what the medication administration was. We're continuing to work on different things. We're putting in a new Pyxis system right now, a new update, and so working to make sure that all of our integration between PatientSafe and Pyxis and Meditech is all fluent and working well. So that's almost been a separate journey, but a very exciting one, because we've certainly accomplished a lot of integration with Meditech in this case.
Absolutely. Next question up is, what is the ratio of owned devices to staff? Steve, you want to start on your side?
Yeah, see, I do. Boy, there's some lessons learned there. We today, first of all, of course, on shift, each nurse has their own device, plus we have a few spares that we roll around. But overall, and I think this number will hopefully help, because I know it helped us to look at this, we have 800 nurses roughly on our staff, and we have 450 iPhones or patient-safe devices. So we're roughly running a 2-to-1 ratio as far as total devices. Now, as we roll out SoftScan and see, of course, you kind of gave the definition of SoftScan in terms of its use of the native camera, we're actually going to move more to a 1-to-1 ratio. And my, speaking of governance, my clinical informatics team is busily working on some type of I don't want to call it a contract, but it's really an agreement with a nurse or a phlebotomist or whoever that talks about the care they're going to give their device and some of the requirements that they'll agree to as far as taking care of their device. So that's kind of what that looks like now.
Thank you. Richard, how about on your side?
Even though we're not fully implemented yet on the nursing units, we're seeing about a 2-to-1 ratio right now, and I'm like Steve. I think that will also increase. But I want to take off on one thing he said that we feel like is real important, and that's the mobile device policy. We've had some general policies for laptops and tablets and things like that, but we're really trying to work on a fair policy, but a policy that makes our staff aware that that phone is pretty expensive, and it's fairly, it's not a HIPAA compliant issue if you lose it. It's more of a cost issue and a hassle factor issue. So we're working on a policy and trying to balance. We don't want it too punitive that they're afraid to use it, but by the same token, we want them to accept responsibility for that device. So that's one of the policies we're working on real heavily right now.
Thank you, Richard. And while we still have a little bit of time, we'll keep going down the question list here. The next one up has been, are you expanding your use of the platform beyond what you have today? It sounded like texting and messaging and voice is the starting point. There's multiple other things that you've mentioned or referred to. Are you continuing to expand the use of the platform? Richard, I think we actually just had this conversation, so I'll start with you on your side.
Sure. We were really excited listening to Steve talk to where they are. We're kind of like at the Ned's first reader stage compared to where they are in the clinical areas. But we're really excited to get the messaging voice rolled out so that we can move quickly into those clinical areas with the bidirectional interfaces and achieve some of those same benefits that Steve's seeing right now. And we are so ready to get rid of our WOWs, our workstation on wheels. I mean, they are so not only expensive but cumbersome, and we really look forward to the day that we can be using these mobile devices for those bedside medication verification, lab specimen collection functions.
Thank you. And Steve, on your side, I know that obviously those functionality has been in place in a one device, one app kind of picture. As you see the initial success with the physician usage, what are some of the other areas that you and your clinical informatics team are looking at for expansion?
Well, see, this is so exciting for me to talk about this particular area because I feel so blessed to work with a group of nurses and physicians that are engaged and excited. We've empowered our nurses to give us ideas, and so I think we could probably develop in something new from now until eternity, and based on the ideas they have. But examples of that, and I would mention that our clinical informatics team, they are all they challenge themselves to spend time on actual nursing floors at least every month. So every one of our clinical informatics nurses actually practices nursing at least 1 to 2 days a month. So it keeps them relevant and keeps the ideas flowing. But I think as we move down the road, once we have all of our physicians completely across the board integrated into the communications and text piece, we're going to continue to develop the things we do with alerts, notifications. I think really another very, very important piece is a lot of the things that we want to have when the nurses do as far as interventions that they might want to be setting up on the system. So as an example, if you have a stroke patient that needs to be rolled from side to side every 20 minutes, being able to have the system do that. And then I think finally, we're really starting to think about and focus on things like nurse leader rounding and some other things using this application and ways we could go about digitally collecting that information as we do some of those critically important rounds.
Thank you. Yes, those are very exciting initiatives for us as well. I believe we're coming up to the top of the hour. I'd just like to quickly thank both of you for the candor, transparency, and some of the very helpful lessons learned shared with the audience here. I'll turn it over to Lori for the conclusion point here. Lori?
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Steve, and Richard for the interesting and informative presentation. We look forward to seeing you at our next HIS Talk webinar, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.